Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy in the modern world, moving into the reign of Pope 233, Paul V, who reigned from 1605 to 1621. The second conclave of 1605 met with the same intentions as the first. The cardinals were generally satisfied with the policies of Clement VIII, so had elected Leo XI, a career diplomat, to follow him with the intention that those policies continue. Leo's untimely death forced the cardinals to look for another man to continue those policies. Since they did not want another conclave to come again so soon, they chose a younger man. And since they wanted the open negotiating policies to continue, they elected another career diplomat. On May 16, 1605, they chose, and he accepted, a 53-year-old Cardinal Camillo Borghese, Borghese, as Pope 233. He he chose the papal name Paul. He was the fifth to use that name. He reigned for 16 years. He was the last pope to take the name Paul until the 20th century. Born in Rome on September 17, 1552, Camillo graduated with a doctorate in law from Padua before entering papal service. He served on the administrative side of the papal bureaucracy before being given a diplomatic mission to Spain. He did well in that position and was rewarded by being made a cardinal in 1596. He was only back in Rome 2 years when the two conclaves of 1605 took place, so he was not well known. His record as a diplomat and the absence of any dark stories about his past allowed the cardinals to believe that he would be a quiet, unassuming pontiff who would cause no trouble. In this, they were mistaken. As often happens in papal history, worldly-minded men mistook obedience for weakness and spirituality for stupidity. With their mindset, they could never have understood a man like Paul V. He was like Sixtus V, Pius V, and Paul IV. He was a deeply spiritual man who cared nothing for the favor of the world. He entirely regarded the church as a necessary fortress, a fortification to protect the faithful from the world, which was, in his mind, the enemy. As Pope, his personal beliefs changed the direction of papal policy away from the moderate diplomatic initiatives of Clement VIII. In terms of governance, one of Paul's first actions as Pope was the creation of the secret Vatican archives. Reflecting his personal experience as a diplomat in foreign missions, that secular rulers would only use information against the interest of the church. Further, Paul became beloved by the people of Rome because of his concern and effort that he expended on projects for their benefit. He completed for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is a shrine for the Universal Church then and now. He completed the nave, the facade, and the portico of St. Peter's, filling the city with a sense of excitement that the century-old building project would soon be completed. Paul also had the ancient Roman aqueduct of Trajan restored and connected to a network of fountains installed throughout the city to provide reliable and clean drinking water for the people. It was not until a crisis emerged with Venice that the people could see that Paul V was not going to be a compromising diplomat like Clement VIII. Recall, yet again, that Italy was not a unified country at this point. Venice was a sovereignty, a separate sovereignty, northeastern Italy, on islands off the coast, but also had territory on the mainland. In terms of governance, it referred to itself as a republic, the Republic of Venice, But in reality, it was an oligarchy, a merchant oligarchy, and it was very jealous of its independence. The oligarchs were, well, it's a plutocracy, an oligarchy of the plutocratic variation, where the oligarchy is ruled by a few, and those few, in the case of Venice, were just incalculably wealthy merchant families who populated the Senate of Venice. And they elected the chief executive of the Republic for life under the title of Doge, D-O-G-E. Venice had often assumed an adversarial posture against the Holy See, in the capacity of the Holy See as also the temporal sovereign of the papal state. But the crisis during the reign of Paul V can be traced to the pride and vindictiveness of one man, an unworthy priest, at one time Procurator General of the Servites of Mary, a religious community established in 1240. This guy's name was Paolo Sarpi, S-A-R-P-I, lived from 1552 to 1623. Sarpi was a native of Venice, in many ways a talented man, having been appointed to teach theology and canon law at the age of 23. His personal theology was obviously in sympathy with the Protestants, even though, like many who betrayed the church, he continued to parasite off of the church. In particular, he believed entirely in their subordinationist ecclesiology of Erastianism, which was a Protestant version of Gallicanism, meaning it's a national church, that the church in each realm should be subordinate to the state, and that the clergy in the realm should be appointed by the state and also supported by the state financially, and then in turn they had to support the government. The government of Venice, for obvious reasons, admired Sarpi because they also thought this way. 3 times they put his name forward for a bishopric in their territory, but each time Rome refused because Rome correctly understood that Sarpi was a crypto-Protestant. As a consolation, the Doge of Venice, at the time Leonardo Donato, created the position of theological advisor to the Republic and gave it to Sarpi. In that role, Sarpi pushed anti-papal and anti-ecclesiastical laws in Venice as a means of seeking vengeance and to assuage his wounded vanity. Even though he's still a priest, this guy is still a priest. Particularly galling to loyal Catholics in Venice was the Sarpi-inspired law that no new church or ecclesiastical institution could be constructed without permission of the government. In itself, a rule about any new building or restricting new buildings is reasonable in a place with limited land like Venice, which is built on islands in a lagoon. However, when the government not only refused permission to build any new churches, but further refused permission for the use of existing buildings to be purchased by the church and renovated to become ecclesial institutions, it was obvious that the government was intent on limiting the church by using the law to refuse to allow it to expand. The next step would be to start curtailing existing church activities. To prevent that from happening, it was decided by local clergy in Venice that the law would have to be challenged. So, in 1606, 2 priests in Venice purchased property with family money, meaning their own personal assets. I mean, they were priests, but they purchased money with personal assets that they inherited from their family, and then proceeded to open a school with a chapel inside of that building, inside of the existing building. They were immediately arrested for violating the law, convicted, and imprisoned for breaking the law. When Pope Paul V learned of this, he demanded their release and further demanded the repeal of that law. The Republic of Venice refused. In this situation, A diplomatic pope like Clement VIII would have tried to negotiate a settlement. But Paul V was a different type. He regarded negotiation as a waste of time and simply as a means of confusing or diluting the truth. He therefore excommunicated the Doge of Venice and the entire Senate of the Republic of Venice. The Venetian government retaliated by banishing from the Republic the Jesuit order, the Theatine order, and the Capuchin order. Pope Paul V responded by placing the entire Republic of Venice under an interdict on April 17, 1606, meaning that the sacraments could not be celebrated, including funerals. Now, this placed the clergy in Venice. They had to make a choice. Were they going to refuse to perform the sacraments or not? And to their eternal shame, the secular clergy of Venice largely followed the lead of Paolo Sarpi, and not only continued celebrating the sacraments in defiance of the papal interdict, but went to great lengths to celebrate them in the most elaborate manner possible, siding with Venice over the church. So this is, it's probably too early to use the term nationalism. Well, it is too early in the sense that people at the time were not using it, but it flows from that same mindset that, I'm going to pick my hometown. I'm going to side with my hometown instead of the Pope. Sarpi himself, even though he was, a priest, had not celebrated Mass in years. Yet after this, he, went out of his way. He personally led the Corpus Christi procession through the city during the period of the interdict in an elaborate pageant that witnesses said was more impressive than the papal procession in Rome. As a result, Sarpi was excommunicated in 1607. A pamphlet war then ensued, which gave much amusement to anti-Catholics throughout Europe. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, a Jesuit, still alive, in service of the Pope, he led the defense of Paul V, with Sarpi leading that of Venice. Sarpi revived arguments of conciliarism from the era of the schism that we already covered in the 14th and early 15th centuries, namely that the Pope was merely a delegated executive for the Church, used for convenience as a symbol of unity, but that the Pope had no divinely ordained authority. So a heresy, just reviving a heresy. He further argued the claims of Gallicanism for Venice, the national church heresy, that the Venetian government provided the safety required for the exercise of religion, and for the sake of public order, the government has a right to demand, and the church has a duty to concede control over the church to the government. This went on for a year. Pope Paul had no intention of backing down, as a central principle of papal policy was at stake, the independence of the church and the church's control over the sacraments. It was the merchant leaders of Venice who wanted a solution, not because they cared about the interdict, but because Poland and Austria refused to do business with them while the interdict was in effect. This affected their income, and that mattered to them. So they pressured the Doge to come to an agreement. So on April 21st, 1607, 1 year and 4 days after it was imposed, the interdict was lifted, the 2 imprisoned priests were released. The clergy in Venice who had defied the interdict were restored to a proper relationship with the church after a pro forma submission to the papal legate. And any who did go through that ritual were forgiven and accepted back into the church, whereas Paolo Sarpi refused. He remained excommunicated and died outside of the church. But the Doge kept him as theological advisor until his death, which means kept him on the government payroll. Sarpi misspent the rest of his life in spewing anti-papal venom in writing. His most notorious work was titled The History of the Council of Trent, published in 1616, which was a savage attack on the papacy, characterizing the Council of Trent as nothing more than a papal maneuver to sabotage true spiritual reform of the church. Since Sarpi was on the payroll of Venice, and did not want to jeopardize his income by causing more trouble to Venice, he published this work in London under a pseudonym, Pietro Polano. This work, which was picked up by publishers in other countries and was circulated, gave ammunition to centuries of anti-papal writers and seminarians. Any work which cites this as a source must be taken as inaccurate. Because so many people were taking the false history seriously, a later Pope, Urban VIII, who reigned from 1623 to 1644, commissioned a Jesuit cardinal, Pietro Pallavicino, Pallavicino, to write the first official history of the Council of Trent. He spent years on the project, finally publishing the work in 2 volumes in 1656 and 57 during the reign of Pope Alexander VII, and its title was The History of the Council of Trent. One of the many baneful consequences of the public disputations provoked by the Venetian interdict was that it revived interest among Catholic theologians in the issue of ecclesiology, the theology of church. As often happens when academic theologians become interested in creative exploration of theology, a new heresy is born. In this case, it was promoted by the dean of the theology faculty of the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, named Edmond Richer, R-I-C-H-E-R, who lived from, he concocted a heresy that's named for him, Richerism. It came about because St. Robert Bellarmine had written a strong defense of the authority of the papacy during the Venetian interdict. Edmond Richer replied with an essay in 1611 titled Power, Ecclesiastical and Political. Richer, of course, was a Gallican, believing in the national church heresy. But his essay went far beyond any assertions of Gallicanism previously made. He posited an entirely new ecclesiology, arguing that divine institution was given by God to the church as the body of Christ, and that it was God's will that each part exercise authority proper to it. Now, up to that point, the argument's not heretical. It's just consistent with the principle of subsidiarity. But then he went beyond Catholic tradition by arguing that the bishops were the successors of the 12 apostles, while priests were the successors of the 72 disciples sent out by Christ in, for example, Luke chapter 10. So this is proposing a new defective sacramentology. He evidently did not even realize the implications of his argument. But Richer's position meant, logically, it would mean that there were, in fact, 2 separate sacraments of holy orders, rather than multiple levels of participation in one sacrament. Further, Richer asserted that religious orders have no divine institution, so they fit into the body of Christ according to the sacramental rank only of the members, whether priest, bishop, lay person. Now, this is partially correct. Religious communities were not directly established by Christ, but it was not correct to limit their place in the church to their particular level of holy orders. Religious orders came into existence, and they still do, come into existence canonically by authority of the Pope. And the Pope's authority is of divine institution, even though Richer rejected that. I'm just, for seminarians, I'm just saying that this is... So religious orders do have a particular position in the church defined for them by the papacy at their creation and recorded in their particular constitutions. And, of course, the church has the authority to adjust that position in the church as they sees fit, or to eliminate the order, to suppress the order altogether. Edmond Richer did not accept this, because he argued that the Pope was the successor of Peter, But Peter did not exercise immediate jurisdiction over the entire ancient church. Therefore, the Pope should not either. Peter and the subsequent popes functioned as symbols of unity only, and had the authority of respect, but not jurisdiction. So, Richer concluded, papal actions like the Venetian interdict were invalid by their nature. Now, in the very first playlist, well, at least chronologically, the Patristics playlist, I go into great detail over this, over Peter and the way he exercised authority and the subsequent popes. So Richer's position is completely wrong. But it takes me multiple videos in the Patristics series to go through that, so I won't repeat it all. If you're interested, on this channel, the Patristics playlist, start from the beginning, and you'll see the arguments as well as the scriptural support. Anyway, with Richer, he proposed an alternate ecclesiology. He argued that the church should be governed as an international federation of national churches. Each national church would be autonomous in matters of internal governance. Each would be governed internally with a bicameral legislature, meaning a two-house legislature, with a lower house consisting of priests and laity, and the upper house consisting of bishops and archbishops. This assembly would elect the ecclesiastical superiors of the nation, the archbishops, bishops, abbots, as well as they would elect representatives of the national church in meeting with the International Federation of other national churches. All appointments would be approved by the monarch, as the monarch is the defender of the church in his or her realm. The International Federation of Churches that Richer proposed would acknowledge the Pope as their spiritual leader and give him honor as such, but he would have no jurisdiction outside of the Papal States. Decisions could only become binding on the Universal Church if decided by a majority vote of a council, which would consist of a bicameral legislature of members who would be elected by each national church. So he wanted the two-house legislature within each nation, and then they would send representatives to the world parliament of church. Naturally, obviously, this is heretical. So Paul V condemned Richerism in 1611 as a blending of three erroneous ecclesiologies: conciliarism, Gallicanism, and Erastianism, with an emerging ideology of state absolutism. And remember, nothing just happened. So this can be traced back to the defective ontology and theology articulated by Marsilius of Padua in Defensor Pacis, 1324, and the Heresy Club that we covered in the early 14th century, earlier in this playlist. For a change, the Pope had encountered no resistance from the French government, as both secular and ecclesiastical authorities were threatened by Richer's notion of representative democracy. Richer did not, he did recant his views after being condemned by the Synod of Sens in 1612, because that was on his home turf. That was just French bishop, so he was condemned by his own people. Yet his ideas did not go away. These ideas of representative government. French political thought of the day was based on the governing structure. So France obviously was a monarchy, but there are different kinds of monarchy. So even by this period, say the English monarchy had some limitations on it, not as many as today, but did have a parliament, a bicameral parliament, two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, that did have some power. In France, there was the hereditary monarchy. There was also an analog to the Parliament of England, but the structure was different. In France, it was called the Estates General, referring to the three estates in the French view of things. The clergy was the first estate, the nobility, the second estate, and the commoners, the third estate. So instead of a bicameral legislature like the English, House of Lords, House of Commons, the French had a three-house, tricameral Now, since Richer did not believe that the clergy should be a separate category in society, he chose the model of the English Parliament, just two houses, a House of Lords and House of Commons, which made particular sense to his French experience, since virtually every bishop in France was of the nobility. They were younger sons of an aristocratic family, whereas every parish priest was a commoner by birth. Now, Richer's views inspired political writers for the next century and a half. His arguments would be used by clergy during the first stage of the French Revolution, who deserted their bishops and the Pope in hopes of creating such a democratic national church. It proved to be a complete disaster, which is covered later in this playlist. Far more famous is, in terms of ecclesial conflicts, was Paul V's actions regarding a Pisan-born astronomer named Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642. So Galileo was his first name, Galileo. His family name, the surname, was Galilei, Galilei. Okay, so the background. The proto-telescope was invented by a Dutch optician named Hans Lippershey, who lived from 1570 to 1619. On October 2nd, 1608, he put it on the market. He tried to sell it. First mistake is what he called it. He didn't call it the telescope. He called it the looker. He tried to sell it to the Dutch government. For the military advantage it offered of magnifying images 3 times the capacity of the unaided eye. He was awarded 900 florins. Those are gold pieces, 900 gold pieces, for his discovery. But the Dutch government did not want to call it the looker. So instead they called it the Dutch perspective glass. And then it got on the market. Word of it spread around Europe. Galileo, at the time, was teaching mathematics at the University of Padua when he heard about the Dutch perspective glass. And he designed his own, which was capable of magnifying images 1,000 times. He naturally turned this device to the sky, where on January 7th, 1610, he observed 3 spherical bodies orbiting Jupiter, not orbiting the Earth. This was the beginning of what he took to be empirical evidence supporting the heliocentric theory, meaning the sun-centered theory of the universe, previously composed by a Polish priest mathematician named Nicholas Copernicus in 1543. But Nicholas Copernicus did not. It was a conceptual abstract theory, and he did not have the tools to prove it. And he was deceased by this point. Shortly afterward, in the same year, 1610, Galileo published a scientific bombshell titled Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, arguing in favor of the Copernican heliocentric, sun-centered universe. The issue being that the prevailing view of the universe, the structure of the universe, was the Ptolemaic view, which was geocentric, seeing the Earth as the center of the universe. Now, as we know now, both of them are wrong. Neither the Earth nor the Sun is the center of the universe. And the theological concerns were overstated, as the importance of Earth derives not from its position or its size, but from its being the place of the incarnation of Christ. The following year, 1611, a renowned Jesuit scientist named Christopher Clavius, Clavius, lived from 1538 to 1612. We met him earlier in this playlist. He was one of those mathematician that calculated, or was one of those who calculated the Gregorian calendar reform in 1582. In 1611, he used his own Dutch perspective glass, or telescope, to confirm Galileo's assertions about the astronomical movements he observed, that there really were at least 3 spherical bodies orbiting Jupiter, not orbiting the Earth. Clavius agreed that this called into question the Ptolemaic geocentric cosmology, but he died the following year in 1612 before being able to pursue the matter or publish about the matter. It was Galileo's misfortune that he did not have the patience and the prudence of Clavius. In the same year that Clavius died, 1612, Galileo published a work titled Discourse on Floating Bodies. And the next year he published a book on sunspots. In both of these he ridiculed anyone who could possibly still hold the Earth-centered, the geocentric cosmology in light of his discoveries. His acerbic tone, condescending posture made enemies that he didn't need to make. One of whom was a Tuscan Dominican, an Italian from Tuscany, named Tommaso Caccini, Caccini. He began preaching against Galileo and reported him to the Papal Inquisition of Paul V in 1616. Caccini argued that the matter was theological because it contradicted it, or, in his mind, it would contradict Scripture, which describes the sun standing still in answer to Joshua's prayer at the Battle of Ajalon during the war with the Amorites. You can look it up. It's in the book of Joshua, chapter 10, verses 12 to 13. Now, this argument is absurd, as miracles, by definition, are divine interventions which transcend physical laws. But since the Protestants had relentlessly pounded Catholics for not being scriptural, the Roman Inquisition would not allow itself to be seen as ignoring a challenge to Scripture. So the theological case against Galileo proceeded. Cardinal Saint Robert Bellarmine was still alive at the time, and he advised the Pope that the Pope should not personally pronounce as Pope on a matter which could not be proven or disproven, and which might actually be true. So his solution was that Galileo's assertions could be proposed and even published, but published as a possible theory. Because in 1616, that's exactly what it was. It was a possible theory, which could be true, could be false. So any claims for certainty on either position were premature. That was Bellarmine's advice, which Paul V wisely followed. If you have a genius on the payroll, you might as well listen to him. So Pius V made no personal ruling on the matter. However, the Roman Inquisition, commanded Galileo to swear that he would not teach heliocentric cosmology, the sun-centered universe, as fact. Galileo agreed under oath. And this was the final action of the Galileo case during the reign of Paul V. But Galileo's case would be reopened during the reign of Urban VIII, and actions taken then are why everyone knows Galileo. Pope Paul V took another action in a different realm of endeavor in terms of sanctification of the Church, which would have long-term benefits for Catholicism in France. And after the wars of religion, that we previously covered, we know France desperately needed it. He approved the Oratory of Jesus Christ on May 10th, 1613. Its spiritual genealogy is as follows. A Frenchman named Pierre de Bérulle, Berulle, lived from 1575 to 1629. He was born into a family of career civil servants, respected, educated, and devoted to both France and to the Church. He became close friends with St. Francis de Sales, whom we covered previously, as the two shared a passion for converting French Huguenots, French Calvinists, to the faith, and for converting dissolute French Catholics back to love of their faith, and for converting slothful and ill-formed French clergy into being true priests of God the Most High. Knowing that he wished to dedicate his life to this, Bérulle was ordained a priest in 1599. He lived a good and a holy life, but felt that God was calling him to do something more specific. Learning of the reforms that had occurred in Spain, Bérulle made a pilgrimage to Spain in 1604 and toured the country. He returned with 7 nuns of the Discourse Carmelite reform of St. Teresa of Avila, whom we covered previously, because he wanted good and holy women in his country who would devote their entire lives to praying for the return of France to authentic Catholicism. Convinced that the Gallican prejudices of the government and ecclesiastical hierarchy of France would forever prevent the decrees of the Council of Trent from being properly implemented in France, Bérulle concluded that the ideals of Trent had to be implemented by faithful French Catholics without waiting for the formal approval of the French hierarchy. Searching for a model of what he wanted to do, he chose St. Philip Neri's Congregation of the Oratory, which we covered previously, approved in 1575 by Pope Gregory XIII. Because St. Philip's conception of the order was in favor of local autonomy, Philip's was used as a model for what would be, in fact, a very different French foundation. It was an oratory. It kept that idea. But Bérulle called it the Oratory of Jesus Christ, and it was approved by Paul V in 1613. Bérulle made some important changes to the model of St. Philip's oratory. The 2 oratories were alike in that both were for secular priests, meaning diocesan priests, who took no vows beyond those of priesthood, and that their core objective was pursuit of priestly perfection. The French oratory differed from the Italian in that the French had a centralized structure, with a superior elected for life, and held a general convocation every 3 years, with a senior council elected by the General Assembly. Votes could be cast by all oratorians who had been ordained and members for 3 years. Office could be held in the oratory only by those who had been ordained and members of the oratory for 7 years. Using this model, Bérulle established 53 such oratories in France before he died, and he died while saying Mass in 1629. He resisted tying the French oratory to a particular ministry, preferring to see his priests pursue perfection in their own chosen ministry. However, as time passed, Bérulle saw that something was needed in France that was obviously not going to just happen on its own. So, seminarians, he understood, nothing just happens. So he directed his men to that purpose. This was the establishment of the first Tridentine model seminaries in France. Bérulle was tremendously influential on the clergy of the period through his establishment of the oratory, which not only formed many seminarians into priests, but also inspired other priests who did not formally join the oratory. One famous example that altered the course of church history occurred in 1613, the same year that Paul V approved the French oratory. A young French priest named Vincent de Paul, later Saint Vincent de Paul, who lived from 1580 to 1660, was introduced to Cardinal Bérulle. This young priest had a remarkable story to tell. Having been brought up in poverty, he only received an education because of local Franciscans, proved to be a good student, so earned himself a place at the University of Toulouse in southern France, culminating in ordination to the priesthood in 1600. In 1605, he was traveling by ship in the Mediterranean, and the ship was captured by pirates, Muslim pirates, and sold. He was sold, which was, as we covered previously, that was part of life then. And since he was a young male, healthy male, he was used as a galley slave, meaning rowing the ships, chained to the oar. For 2 years, he endured this humiliating servitude before he managed to escape. He spent time in Rome. He was in the Mediterranean, and he managed to escape in Italy. So, he was traveling, and he went to Rome on his way back to going home. But he had no clear idea what to do with his life and his priesthood after such a traumatic experience. I mean, after 2 years as a galley slave, does he just, go back in some parish and wake up and eat a croissant, or wake up, say mass, and then eat a croissant, and just pretend like nothing happened? It was his good fortune. He told his story as he was traveling, and shared what he's like, I don't know what to do. I mean, does this mean anything? Or was it just a happenstance and, just some bad thing that happened and I just have to move on? Or does it mean something? Well, he told this to the right people who knew about Beyrul and arranged for a meeting. And it was his good fortune that he met Beyrul, because Beyrul knew exactly what Vincent should do with his life and priesthood after this experience. He must use it to perfect himself and perfect his priesthood. This perfection was to be achieved in a number of ways. First, Vincent began visiting ports and ministering to other galley slaves, both in material ways, food and clothing, and in spiritual ways, that offering them comfort in the encounter with a priest who had also been enslaved, representing to them Christ, who had also been unjustly imprisoned. He then expanded his ministry by offering spiritual talks, public talks, and missions. And sometimes he was able to just go on the galley ship and preach to the guys while they were in port, still chained, in their cages. He then moved to preaching in the ports themselves, then moved inland to preach to the peasants who lived near the ports, but who were totally neglected by the official church establishment because they were not able to fund a benefice for the support of a resident priest. And as we covered way back in the medieval course, that's just the way things were done then. Like Beyrul, St. Vincent de Paul began to attract men who were interested in this sort of ministry, preaching and spiritual conferences. Cardinal Beyrul heard about Vincent's success, encouraged and assisted Vincent in turning Vincent's followers into the Congregation of the Mission in 1625. They're better known as the Vincentians, but still priests and sisters and brothers in the order behind their name is CM, Congregation of the Mission, not V for Vincentians. Beyrul interested Vincent de Paul in seminaries by getting him and his Vincentian priests to offer spiritual retreats for seminarians before they received minor orders and major orders. And these were well received. In some dioceses, the bishops who were impressed started having their seminarians take an entire year off between minor seminary and major seminary to take a year of spiritual formation with the Vincentians, even though they weren't going to become Vincentians. Eventually, the Vincentians began actually establishing seminaries of their own, not only to train their own guys, but to train seminarians for diocesan priesthood. By the time of the French Revolution, the Vincentians had 63 seminaries, which was 1/3 of all the seminaries in France. So this is one example of Beyrul's influence. Thousands were touched in France by him and by the other priests he inspired. The key to his success was spiritual clarity and simplicity. Clearly defined and attainable spiritual objectives. Not, let's save the world, because then, that's too vague. But clear, achievable, actionable, spiritual objectives. Under Beyrul's had his own confessor and spiritual director who was a Carthusian. And under this Carthusian director, Beyrul began with a spirituality of annihilation of disordered desires in the self as a necessary prerequisite to any substantive spiritual development. He then shaped a personal spiritual vision based on the incarnation of Christ. His imagination was captivated by this image of a human being assumed by the divine, or by the divine assuming, human nature, and was certain that theology and spirituality must reflect this union of God and man, natural and supernatural, in order to grasp reality, because that's the way God made things. There is a natural order and a supernatural order. Adoration and praise are the only proper responses from the human person to the incarnate Word. Adoration and praise, correctly done, lead to a life outside in the daily realm, to following the example and the teachings of the incarnate Word of Jesus while on earth, meaning, as we see in the gospel. So this following that example would be a life of holiness, spiritual and practical at the same time. Beyrul and his priests managed to take a complicated dogma of Christology and use it as the basis for a very popular preaching ministry with the faithful. They avoided the trap of conflicts between a high and a low Christology, which had plagued antiquity because of dualism, and instead emphasized the virtues as tangible means of following Christ. The theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and the cardinal virtues, practical virtues, of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Through the oratory and through the Vincentians, which were inspired by the oratory, this spirituality shaped priestly formation in France for the next century to accomplish the healing of the country after the ruinous wars of religion. Across the Channel in England, the situation of Anglo-Catholics, English Catholics, was increasingly desperate. Anti-popery laws excluded English Catholics from voting, from holding public office, from holding officer commissions in the military, therefore, preventing them from commanding ships in the Navy, and even imposed extra taxes on them. Persecution affects people in different ways. Some who are persecuted just grow in patience and fortitude, and just accept, carry the cross, and achieve a profound spiritual connection with God. Others, however, rebel against injustice and fight. Now, as we saw previously, both strains had already developed among Anglo-Catholics, the peaceful and the militant. During the reign of Paul V, a group of the militant strain of Anglo-Catholicism decided to end the persecution of Catholics by taking over the government of England, doing a regime change from within. In order to accomplish this, they planned to wipe out the existing government in one stroke. The result was the infamous Gunpowder Plot. They recruited a Yorkshire convert to Catholicism. York is in northern England. A guy who had military experience, fighting for Spain and the Netherlands. His name was Guy Fawkes, Fawkes. Lived from 1570 to 1606. The organizer of the conspiracy was Robert Catesby, Catesby. He rented a cellar, a basement, which extended partly under the House of Parliament. And, he and his co-conspirators dug further in, so to get further under the Parliament, and then fill the basement with barrels of gunpowder. The plan was that Fawkes would ignite the barrels when the king and Parliament were in full session. So the king, is not a member of Parliament, but for special occasions like the opening of Parliament and the closing, the king would ceremonially appear, and everybody would, do homage, and then he would leave. But so that was the only times, when the king and the Parliament would be in the same room at the same time. And that the explosion would then be a trigger. So the other conspirators would be outside with other conspirators. And then when they saw the explosion, then they would lead a military uprising in the countryside, move into London, and since all the government, they'd all be dead, presumably, if the plot worked, then they could just replace them with Catholics and then do a regime change and make it a Catholic government again. The plot failed because it was betrayed inadvertently when one of the conspirators, named Francis Tresham, told his cousin, Lord Monteagle, not to attend Parliament on November 5th. Didn't tell him why, just said don't attend Parliament on November 5th. Suspicious, Lord Monteagle then told others, and they also were suspicious, so they started investigating. Why would a relative not want you to go on this particular day? So an investigation of the grounds led to that they caught Guy Fawkes in the cellar with the gunpowder, waiting for his chance to ignite the barrels. He was captured. He was put to horrific torture, which resulted in the entire list of conspirators being revealed, at least all of those that he knew. Now, some of them had already taken up arms. Even though they didn't see the explosion, they nevertheless, they were committed. And some of those were killed in battle. And that was the fate of the man who originally purchased the cellar, Robert Catesby. Fawkes and other captured survivors were executed on January 31st, 1606. The day of the foiled plot, November 5th, became known as Guy Fawkes Day in England and was an occasion for rabid anti-Catholic demonstrations for centuries. A practice which was brought to the United States, to the English colonies, in what became the United States, until George Washington prohibited it during the Revolution. During the reign of Paul V, in 1618, the last of the wars of religion began. No one could have imagined what was beginning, but from our perspective, in retrospect, we know that for the next 30 years, Europe was engulfed in a bloodbath that resulted in the material ruin of Central Europe, the death of 1/3 of the population of Central Europe. It is universally referred to as the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. It was the trigger, remember, nothing just happens. It was caused by three variables in the political calculus of the day, which we've been following, throughout the playlist. Religious affiliation, philosophy of government, and the balance of power. England, Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway were firmly and irretrievably Protestant, while France, Spain, Italy, Austria, Bavaria, and Poland were Catholic, leaving Central Europe, particularly the rest of Germany outside of Bavaria, divided between the two, Catholic and Protestant. Added to this, we've seen that within both camps there were deep divisions. France and Austria, though both Catholic countries, despised each other. There had been multiple wars with each other over centuries, and many more would follow. And the various Protestant movements were often at each other's throats, as often as they were against the Catholics. So within each of these armed camps, there were also competing ecclesiologies, meaning theology of church, as well as competing philosophies of government, ideology. Some favored absolute monarchy. Others, constitutional monarchies, like England, with some form of representative assembly. Whereas Calvinist Protestants promoted elective democracy that would mirror the legislative structure of their church. Because they have a congregational, like each congregation is independent. They don't have bishops or, Now, as if these elements were not confusing enough, it must be remembered that statesmen and churchmen on all sides believed, or at least it was in their, within their awareness of the balance of power, meaning that the safety of all is served by no one nation ever being allowed to become dominant over the others. This balance of power was perpetually upset by the dynastic marriages of the various royal houses, particularly the Habsburgs, whose marriage alliances gave their families claims on Spain, northern Italy, Naples in southern Italy, Austria, and all the Spanish holdings in the New World, as well as Spanish holdings elsewhere in Europe, like the Netherlands, and claims to the title of Holy Roman Emperor. So all of these combustibles were brought together and ignited by the impending death of Holy Roman Emperor Matthias, who reigned from 1612 to 1619. He had no surviving legitimate children. His successor as Holy Roman Emperor would be determined by the 7 Imperial Electors, according to the Golden Bull of 1356, which we covered earlier in this playlist, as well as the early modern playlist. So of the 7 electors, 3 were ecclesiastical princes, and therefore Catholic. The Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Cologne, and the Archbishop of Trier. 3 other electors were Protestants, laymen. The Elector of Saxony, the Elector of Brandenburg, and the Elector Palatine, all 3 within Germany. The position of the 7th elector was the one that precipitated the 30 Years' War. The 7th elector was the King of Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. Complicating that, even though the title king, as we normally use it, is a hereditary title, but in Bohemia at the time, the position of king was elected. And a tertiary level of confusion with this is that it happened to be, the elected king of Bohemia happened to be Matthias, the same guy who was Holy Roman Emperor. Meaning that when he died, the position of emperor and the position, one of the electorates, the Bohemian electorate, would both be vacant at the same time. Catholics and Protestants understood, therefore, that the crown of Bohemia, carrying with it the 7th Imperial Electorate, had to be theirs, because it would bring with it a majority in the Imperial College, and therefore they could decide who to vote. Catholics in Bohemia wanted another Habsburg, specifically Ferdinand II. At the time, he was Archduke of Styria, Styria, lived from 1619 to 1637. Whereas the Protestants decided on a Calvinist to support a Calvinist, Friedrich V, at the time Elector of Saxony. So he was already an elector, so he could cast a vote for himself. Saxony was one of the electorates. And if he became king of Bohemia, he would have two votes, voting for himself as the next Holy Roman Emperor. So Calvinists in Bohemia pushed their case hard through publicity, promoting their cause as a cause of national unity and independence from the domination of the Austrian Habsburgs, who of course were a different ethnicity. The Austrians were of Teutonic culture, Germanic culture, whereas the Bohemians, they were Czechs, so of a Slavic lineage. In this way, they hoped that they could persuade even Catholics in Bohemia who were patriotic to turn against the Habsburgs in order to be free of foreign domination. Catholics in Europe became nervous at the Calvinist success using this strategy. So they obtained from Ferdinand II, their guy, the Habsburg candidate, the Catholic candidate, a written promise to be published that he would respect, that if he became King of Bohemia, and or Holy Roman Emperor, that he would respect religious freedom, meaning he would allow Protestants freedom of worship. That commitment was dated June 17th, 1617. So the Catholic hope by doing this was that moderate Calvinist in Bohemia would accept it as preferable to another war. And as we covered previously, Bohemia had been through a number of wars, largely over this same issue. Well, not the election of Holy Roman Emperor, but over desiring independence, to secede from the Holy Roman Empire. And then, so now, the other side, the Bohemian Calvinists were concerned that this strategy would appeal to the natural apathy of human nature, as well as the legitimate fear of the prospect of a religious war, which had been so ruinous to Bohemia in the 15th century. And their fear proved to be well-founded, as the crown of Bohemia was indeed offered to the Catholic Habsburg Ferdinand. But not wanting to lose their chance, the Calvinist Bohemians formed their own shadow government under Count Heinrich von Thurn, Thurn, claiming as their own the cause of national and religious freedom. They commenced this reign of freedom by murdering the Catholic Ferdinand's regents on May 22nd, 1618, and then offering the crown to the German Protestant Friedrich V of Palatine, who was also an elector. And in that way, the 30 Years' War began. So with the murder of the regents, that was the beginning of hostilities. Fighting commenced even before Emperor Matthias actually died on March 20th, 1619. Because both the Habsburgs and the Calvinists had spread across Europe, they were able to recruit from a larger population base and therefore assemble huge armies. These armies had to be supplied, a burden which fell on the Central European lands in which they fought, meaning on the local populations that they exploited. Since these troops were essentially mercenaries from other lands, they cared absolutely nothing for the well-being of the indigenous people where they fought. Atrocities were committed by both armies against civilians, and only escalated when the need of the leaders on both sides prevented them from imposing proper discipline on troops who violated civilians. The 30 Years' War, spanned the reign of 4 popes. The most important engagement during the reign of the pope we're covering now, Paul V, was the Battle of the White Mountain on November 8, 1620, at which the Catholic army, led by Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria, engaged and crushed the Protestant army, led by Ernst von Mansfeld. It was on a large chalk deposit, which gave the battle its name, the White Mountain. The Catholic army then occupied Prague, the capital of Bohemia, but then disgraced themselves by pillaging the city and brutalizing the civilian population. Numerically, I'd say probably a numerical majority of the population of Prague at this time were Catholic. Maybe not a majority, it certainly would have been close. The Elector Friedrich, whom the Bohemian Calvinists had trusted with their fate, fled the city when his general lost the battle. The guy elected Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand, gave thanks for the victory by funding the construction of a church in Rome, which still stands. It's called Santa Maria della Vittoria, Our Lady of the Victory. In the side chapel, so if you enter the church, walk down the center aisle, and go to the sanctuary, but don't enter the sanctuary, but just stop at the foot of the sanctuary, then turn left. Then you'll see there's a side altar, and on the wall above the side altar is a world-famous sculpture sculpted by Bernini, a guy we'll meet later in this series. And the statue is world-famous. It's the Ecstasy of Santa Teresa. So you can look that up. It's an astonishing piece. I don't know how he got marble to do that. I mean, it looks like she's moving. Pope Paul V had a stroke during a liturgical ceremony. He survived the stroke, but never recovered. He died the following year on January 28, 1621. He was followed by Pope Gregory XV, to whose reign we will turn in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.